first time I heard it, I was already awake. I don't sleep well anymore. Not since we moved into this house. Not since I started waking up at exactly 3 a.m. every night without fail. I don't know what rouses me. It isn't noise, at least not at first. It's just a feeling, a coldness in my gut, a whisper of unease that pulls me from restless dreams. That night, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, the faintest wisp of breath curling into the cold air. Beside me, Claire curled on her side, breathing in the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. The world was silent. Then came the knocking, 3 soft taps. I froze. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But as I strained to listen, it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against our front door. I turned toward the bedroom door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Maybe it was an animal, a branch in the wind. But there was no wind, and the knocks were too precise, too measured. I reached over and shook Claire's shoulder. She groaned, pulling the blankets tighter around her. "Claire," I whispered, "did you hear that?" She mumbled something incoherent and turned away. I hesitated, then sat up, every hair on my body prickling as I listened. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the front door. I glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. exactly. A cold sensation trickled down my spine. For several moments I did nothing. I just sat there, frozen, waiting. The knocking didn't come again. I wanted to check, to peek out the window, but something in me recoiled at the thought. A deep, primal instinct whispered, "Don't look." So I didn't. Instead, I lay back down, telling myself it was nothing. But I didn't sleep. The next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Always at 3 a.m., always 3 knocks. Claire was starting to get annoyed. "It's probably some stupid kid messing around," she muttered, half asleep, when I shook her awake. "Go back to bed, Matt." But I couldn't, because on the 3rd night, I heard something new. A whisper. "Let me in." The words were barely audible, a breath of sound against the wood of the door. I went rigid. "Let me in." A child's voice, small, fragile. I swallowed hard, glancing at Claire, who was still asleep beside me. Slowly, I slid out of bed, my bare feet pressing against the cold hardwood. I moved toward the bedroom door, each step careful, silent. The hallway was dark, the air thick with something heavy and unseen. When I reached the front door, I hesitated. The urge to check the peephole was overwhelming, but something clenched in my gut, warning me not to. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door. Seconds, minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. I didn't look. I turned and walked back to bed, my heart pounding in my throat. But as I climbed under the covers, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was still standing on the other side of the door, waiting. By the 5th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. When the knocking came at 3 a.m., I was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark hallway beyond our open bedroom door. Claire hadn't woken up this time. The sound was louder now, more insistent. Slowly I rose to my feet. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stepped forward, moving like a man in a trance. The air was thick, suffocating. The closer I got to the door, the heavier my limbs felt. Tap, tap, tap. I reached the door. For a moment I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, almost against my own will, I leaned forward and pressed my eye to the peephole. A child stood on the porch. A small boy, no older than 6 or 7, bathed in the dim glow of the porch light. But something was wrong. His skin was pale, too pale, like wax. His clothes were tattered and dirty. But the worst part were his eyes, or rather, the lack of them. Two dark, empty sockets stared back at me. I sucked in a sharp breath, stumbling backward, my stomach twisting in horror. The boy's head tilted slightly. Then, in that same fragile whisper, he spoke. "Let me in." I clamped my hand over my mouth, struggling to stay silent. He knew I was there. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Let me in." His voice was so small, so pleading. I almost reached for the lock. Almost. Then something changed. The whisper turned sharp, angry. "Let me in!" The doorknob rattled violently. I stumbled backward, heart slamming against my ribs. My vision blurred as I turned and ran back to the bedroom, nearly tripping over myself in my desperation to get away. I shut the door and locked it, pressing my back against the wood, my breath coming in short, gasping bursts. The house fell silent. The knocking didn't return that night, but I knew it wasn't over. I didn't tell Claire what I saw. Not at first. But the next morning, when I finally built up the courage to check the front porch, I found something that made my stomach drop. Handprints. Small, childlike handprints smeared across the wood. They weren't made of dirt. They were made of blood. I stared at them, my breath fogging in the cold morning air as I crouched down, my fingers hovering just above the smudges on the wood. The stains were dark, dried into the grain, not fresh, but not old either. Blood. The realization made my stomach churn. I jerked my hand back as if burned, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Maybe it was some sick prank. Maybe a raccoon had gotten injured and... No. I already knew the truth. The thing at the door wasn't human. Claire's voice broke my trance. "Matt!" I turned quickly, blocking her view. She stood in the doorway in her robe, her face still heavy with sleep. "What are you doing out here?" "Nothing," I said too quickly, standing up. "Just thought I heard something." She frowned, rubbing her arms. "Again?" I nodded. Her expression softened with concern. "Maybe we should call the cops. If some kid keeps knocking on our door..." I almost laughed. What would I even tell them? A faceless child keeps whispering at our door every night at 3 a.m. Oh, and by the way, it left bloody handprints behind. They'd think I was insane. Still, I nodded. "Yeah, maybe." She sighed. "Come inside. It's freezing." I glanced one last time at the handprints before following her in, locking the door tight behind me. That day, I spent hours online, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. I found something. It took hours of sifting through forums, old newspaper archives, even ghost stories on local legend websites. And then, buried deep in the recesses of an old blog about haunted places in our town, I saw it. A story. About a boy. 30 years ago, a child went missing in our neighborhood. He was 6 years old. His name was Peter Lawson. According to the reports, Peter was last seen playing outside his home, our home, before he vanished without a trace. No witnesses, no clues, just gone. The case was never solved, but the rumors, they said something darker. People whispered that Peter's disappearance wasn't natural, that something took him, that he had been lured away in the night. A few months after he went missing, his mother started reporting strange knocks on her door at exactly 3 a.m. She claimed she saw him once, through the peephole, but his eyes were missing. She said he whispered to her, pleaded to be let inside. She never did. The knocking continued for weeks, then months, until one night it just stopped. Peter was never seen again. His mother, however, was found dead in her bedroom just a year later. The cause? Both of her eyes were gouged out. I slammed the laptop shut. My pulse roared in my ears. My skin crawled, the room suddenly feeling too small, too tight. Claire noticed my expression as she walked into the room. "Matt, what's wrong?" I hesitated. I wanted to tell her everything. Wanted to tell her about the legend, the missing boy, the way I had seen him with my own eyes. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I forced a smile. Nothing. Just reading some old ghost stories. She rolled her eyes. "No wonder you can't sleep." That night, I didn't sleep at all. And at 3 a.m., I heard the knocking again. I squeezed my eyes shut. The whisper came next. "Let me in." I clenched my fists, my body rigid beneath the blankets. "Let me in." This time, Claire heard it. She sat up slowly, blinking in the darkness. What the hell was that? I grabbed her arm. "Don't look." Her breath hitched. "Let me in." The door rattled. The whispering turned to a guttural shriek. Then, silence. Claire clutched my arm so tightly, I thought her nails might break skin. We didn't move, didn't breathe. And after what felt like an eternity, the sun finally rose. But the knocking didn't stop. It started happening even when it wasn't 3 a.m., at noon, at dusk. Anytime the house was quiet, we'd hear it. Tap, tap, tap. Always the same, always waiting. We should have left, we should have run, but we didn't, because by the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. That night, the power went out. At exactly 2:59 a.m., the faint glow of the alarm clock beside me blinked out. The heater clicked off. The house somehow felt even colder. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen faded into silence. The world went still, but it wasn't completely dark. A pale blue glow spilled in through the windows. Moonlight. The world outside was bathed in cold silver light, casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. The trees in the yard swayed in an unseen wind, their skeletal branches scraping against the house like fingers on a coffin lid. I sat up, a chill creeping down my spine. Claire stirred beside me. "Matt," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. Before I could answer, tap, tap, tap. My stomach twisted into knots. The knocking was inside the house. Claire went rigid. "Matt!" I held up a hand, listening. The sound came again, but this time it wasn't from the front door. It was from the hallway. A long, slow knocking, directly against our bedroom door. Tap, tap, tap. My lungs seized, the air refusing to come. Claire gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Then, "Let me in." Her breath shuddered against my shoulder. The voice was right outside our door. A child's whisper, soft, small, deceptively fragile. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the doorknob twisted. My entire body seized. Claire let out a choked whimper, her grip tightening on my arm. "Let me in." The voice wasn't small anymore. It was wrong, lower, distorted, hungry. The knocking turned violent. The door shook, the handle rattled, the wood groaned under an invisible force. Then, a whisper, but not from the door. "You looked." My blood turned to ice. Claire's hand tightened on my wrist. Slowly, so slowly, I turned my head. The boy was inside the room, standing in the corner. His small, frail frame cast a long, distorted shadow in the moonlight. His hollow sockets locked onto mine. A slow, unnatural smile stretched across his face. "Now you see what I see." The pain was instant, like knives stabbing into my skull, twisting, tearing. I dropped to my knees, clutching my face as fire seared through my eyes. Claire screamed. I felt her hands on me, shaking me, trying to pull me away. but I was already falling. Everything blurred. Everything went dark. I woke up to silence, a deep, suffocating silence. The first thing I noticed was the smell, antiseptic, bleach, the sharp, sterile scent of a place that never truly sleeps. Then, the beeping, a slow, rhythmic beep, 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 coming from somewhere beside me, a hospital. I tried to move, but my body felt wrong, heavy, slow, distant. A dull ache throbbed in my skull. My limbs felt weighed down, wrapped in a fog I couldn't shake. And then I noticed something else. Darkness. Not the kind of darkness you experience when you wake up in the middle of the night. Not the kind where your eyes need a second to adjust. This was absolute, empty, infinite. I tried to blink, but nothing changed. My breath stalled in my throat. No, 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 no. My hands flew to my face, searching. I felt rough bandages, thick, wrapped tightly over my eyes. My stomach turned. My pulse spiked. I clawed at them, desperate, needing to feel something underneath, but... Matt? The voice was small, familiar. Claire. I stilled. She was right next to me. I turned my head toward her voice, my breath shaking. But I saw nothing. Just an endless void. A sob caught in my throat. Matt, Claire whispered again. Her voice was tight, breaking. I felt her fingers lace through mine. Warm, trembling. I couldn't see her, but I could hear the way her breath came in short, shallow bursts, uneven and strained. I could feel the way her grip trembled against my skin. I didn't need to see to know she was crying. And in that moment, I knew I would never see again. The first few nights home were a blur of silence and sedation. The painkillers kept me heavy, floating somewhere between sleep and waking. Claire barely spoke. When she did, her voice sounded far away, distant. She hadn't left my side since we got back, but she wasn't the same. She moved carefully around me, hesitant, as if I might break, or worse, as if she might. She never talked about what happened, and neither did I, because I thought, hoped, it was over. But deep down, I knew better. It was the 5th night home when it happened. I was deep in a medicated sleep, lost in the black nothingness that had become my world. The room was still. Claire's warmth beside me was the only thing grounding me in reality. Then, I felt her leave the bed, a subtle shift, the weight of her body lifting from the mattress, the sound of sheets rustling. Then a pause, a breath. She was listening. The air thickened, pressing against my skin like static before a storm. Then, a soft tap. Claire sucked in a sharp breath. A second tap. Her breathing quickened. A third tap. Slow, deliberate, coming from the front door. I forced myself awake, my body sluggish from the meds. Claire. My voice came out dry, cracked. She didn't answer. I swallowed, forcing the words out. Did you hear that? She exhaled shakily. Yes. A pit opened in my stomach. I turned my head, reaching blindly. What time is it? Silence. A long pause. Too long. Then, Claire's voice, barely a whisper. 3 a.m. The words barely escaped her lips. I swung my legs over the bed, pushing myself upright. Claire, don't... A floorboard creaked. She was moving toward the door. Claire, wait. I grabbed at the empty space in front of me, but my hands found nothing. She kept walking, too slow, too steady, like she wasn't moving herself at all. Claire! My voice cracked with panic. Come back! Don't look! She gasped. Not just a gasp. A sound I'd never heard from her before. Something raw and broken. The kind of sound you make when the world stops making sense. My heart stopped. "Claire," I whispered. She didn't respond. I heard one step backward, then another. I forced myself forward, my hands reaching, searching. "Claire, answer me." Then, a slam. The front door. A sudden rush of cold air swept through the house. I lunged toward the sound, stumbling blindly through the darkness. My hands hit the doorframe, gripping it tight. The night air curled around me, too cold, too sharp. I strained my ears, listening, hoping. But there was nothing. No retreating footsteps, no breath, just silence. She was gone. I reached forward, blind hands grasping at empty space. "Claire?" My voice came out small. I stood frozen in the doorway, heart slamming against my ribs. The cold air pressed against me. The house was silent. Claire was gone.